Joining us now is Ambassador John Bolton, who served in the Trump administration as National Security Advisor and in George W. Bush's administration as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, one of many posts he has had throughout his career. And you have paid close attention to foreign policy for decades now. Ambassador, what's your assessment of Secretary Blinken's recent trip to China and President Biden's recent comment that Xi is a dictator in his view?
Well, I think there was a lot less to Blinken's visit than met the eye. I think it accomplished its main objectives. And I think, in a sense, when you go begging to talk to a foreign government, particularly one as authoritarian as China, that it gives the wrong impression, that we are the ones who are needy. We're the ones who need the conversation. And whatever papering over differences the Blinken trip may have accomplished, President Biden blew it away the next day. I have to say, I agree with his comment. I think Xi Jinping is a dictator. It was interesting, I think, that he said Xi didn't know about the famous Chinese balloon. I have my doubts about that. It'd be hard to believe he didn't at least know about the program. But in any event, the Chinese took offense at it. And there's something to be said here for Americans to understand when people are so sensitive about these things and make such an issue out of it. They are exalting process over substance, and we shouldn't play that game.
What is the cost of Biden's comment about Xi being a dictator in his view?
Well, I think from Xi's point of view, actually the thing that he disagreed with the most was the idea he didn't know about something going on inside his empire. But they're able to make it into a big affair, and that causes their sycophants around the world to say, see, it's the United States that's exacerbating tensions. I used to know the aphorism, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's the Chinese that are wielding and threatening the sticks and stones in the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere, not the United States.
Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice recently told CBS, she said to CBS Mornings, "I'm concerned because whenever you've had two great powers that start banging around, particularly with a lot of military force, you have to be concerned about maybe what could happen down the line, an accident," and she worries about conflict. Is her assessment right?
Well, I think we should be worried about conflict because I think when an adversary like China threatens it, when they take provocative actions as they have against American air and naval vessels in East Asia, when they throw blockades around the island of Taiwan and a whole host of other things, I think you should take that as warning that indeed they may be serious.
If the United States and the Chinese military are not communicating in any sort of back-channel way, how close could we come to war or some kind of mistake being made in the interpretation of action?
Well, I'm not at all sure there's not communication at a relatively lower level. It's the visible chairman of the Joint Chiefs level that has broken down. And that can be an important way of communicating. But I think the real risk here is not lack of communication. I think the Chinese are communicating their intentions very clearly. They're trying to push us back from the Western Pacific. They're trying to muscle us away from Taiwan. I don't think these close encounters that the Chinese precipitate are accidental. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They don't need to communicate verbally. They're doing it through maneuvers just short of the use of force. And I think that's what they respect, not words. I think they want to see whether we have the resolve to maintain our efforts at deterrence to prevent conflict.
Let's turn to former President Donald Trump. You served in his administration. You've seen up close how he handles classified materials. You briefed him on classified material frequently inside the Oval Office as National Security Advisor. What was he like when you would give him a piece of classified material? Would he put it in his pocket? Would he bring it back to the residence, or would he give it back to you?
You know, it would depend on the circumstances. Many times he had classified information in briefing papers that were provided to him or would be presented to him in the Situation Room. Sometimes he was interested in it. If it was a lot of heavy reading, he was usually not interested in it. There were pictures, graphs, charts that reflected classified information. That seemed to get his attention. But there was no particular pattern that I discerned. I was not surprised when the reports came out of having over 300 classified documents, because I think he could have collected them over the course of 4 years in a very haphazard way. And there might have been more documents that we don't know about that were destroyed at some point. What was bothersome, I think, to all of us was that Trump just didn't seem to absorb the sensitivity of some of this information, how difficult it was to acquire, how dangerous it could be to the United States if it fell into the wrong hands. I think he was briefed on all this before I arrived in the early days of the administration, but I must say by the time I got there in April of 2018, it seemed to have gone in one ear and out the other.
Is there any moment that, looking back, alarms you when you think about Trump's conduct when it came to classified material?
Well, I think the most graphic story is one that everybody knows about, that he was shown an overhead picture of a failed missile launch in Iran. He asked to keep it. I have to say I wasn't in the room at that particular time. I was overseas. I'm sure the people there tried to get it back. He is the president. And he kept it, and as the intelligence officials who had given it to him were driving back to their offices in Langley, Virginia, somebody called them and said, he's tweeted the picture out. So that's a kind of utterly irresponsible action. There's no foreign policy, no national security benefit to making that picture public. He did it because he could.
Did you ever give him something when you were in the administration and he didn't give it back?
Well, I rarely gave him things, but that's not to say that we didn't supply a river of decision memos that he had to sign off on, essentially all of which were classified. Now, we know for a fact that they all came back out of the Oval Office. Sometimes I had to take a document in and get him to sign it. What we don't know is how many copies he made of parts of it or all of them. Those are potentially some of the documents that might be in that stack of 300 that he kept.
When you were talking to your colleagues on the National Security Council staff and those working in that realm inside the administration, did anyone ever privately confide to you that they're worried about how the president was handling something they had briefed him on, or even a piece of paper?
Well, I think we were generally concerned about it. I think the intelligence briefers who came in some mornings every week to provide him with briefings, which he didn't read the president's daily brief. Every president processes information in different ways. But I think the briefers were very conscious of the risks that some of this information might be compromised, and they did their best to try and get it back. Many times they were successful. Apparently there were too many when they were not.
Did you ever go to Bedminster with him?
I was in Bedminster and meetings that we had in skiffs that were prepared there with classified information.
Did that golf club ever worry you as a setting for classified information, and who could maybe be coming into the club and talking to Trump?
Well, it was surreal in the sense of past presidents who may not have had elaborate houses, but at least they could be protected securely. It wasn't open to the public, as it were, open to members. I'm sure both for the Secret Service and for those directly concerned with the security of the documents, it was a continuing worry.
Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, she also said on CBS Mornings that she can't say whether she would back Trump or not. She wants to avoid talk of politics. Is this a time for choosing, to use an old Reagan phrase, for the Republican Party on Trump? Can anyone sit on the sidelines?
I think with the evidence of everything that's happened since he first entered the race for the 2016 nomination, that you have to make a choice. I would not vote for Trump in 2024. I didn't vote for him in 2020. I did in 2016. By the time I left the White House, I was convinced he was not fit to be president. And I want to say this is not a question about his personality or some of his personal attributes. This is a question of somebody who didn't know much about the federal government when he entered the job, didn't know much more when he left, didn't care to know much, didn't appreciate the gravity of some of the issues he dealt with. COVID was a great tragedy for the United States. We could have faced far graver crises. Thank God we didn't. I think it's a danger for the United States if he gets a second term.
What does a second term look like if Trump wins, in terms of national security in particular?
Well, it's very hard to see who would serve in a second Trump term. I'm sure people would, but a lot of people didn't want to serve at the beginning. Others of us went in thinking that we could do the job that others had done for other presidents. They won't go back in again, so it's really kind of hard to say who's left. That's one reason to be worried. And I think not just on the national security side, although that's the most significant, but really across the range of governmental functions.
Former Attorney General Bill Barr said on Sunday in an interview with Face the Nation that Trump's a troubled man. Would you agree?
I think he's completely untroubled. I think he sees the world very clearly, and it's through one prism. How does this benefit Donald Trump?
And he says he can solve the Ukrainian war in a day. What kind of deal or proposal do you think he'd actually put on the table?
I think that's a good example of why he's not fit to be president. It's a delusional statement. It's boast and braggadocio. It's not based in reality. It wouldn't happen. Mother Teresa couldn't solve it in a day.
Are you cooperating with the government in any way on the documents investigation as someone who had served alongside him and knows how he operates?
I'm not. I've not been contacted by any of those investigators.
What about the January 6th investigation? How seriously do you think that could be for Trump?
Well, I think from what I've heard in conversations around the country, these investigations are very wide-ranging. It's not just the actual events of January the 6th, and we don't know what evidence the prosecutors have. I think a lot of people think if we don't know about the evidence, they must not have it. To me, it's an example of the Justice Department doing a good job in keeping things confidential. So on that basis, I don't think anybody can predict whether there's a potential prosecution there. But I would say, as in the documents case, if it's possible to bring a case, the sooner they bring it together, the better. And in terms of the documents case, the sooner they bring it to trial, the better.
Did you ever see him with his boxes of papers inside the White House?
Well, I saw the boxes and I saw what was put in them, and it frankly, though, never occurred to me that maybe he was putting classified documents in there with his news clippings. If that's right, and he has said it in his own voice, then it seems to me that's pretty strong evidence of how little concern he had for the sensitivity of the classified material, just all pieces of paper to him.
You know what this material is so well. You've served in this area for a long time. When some Republicans go, oh, he just had papers up in his office, he was going to go through them eventually, this is not a big deal, what would your response be?
That completely misunderstands the nature of foreign espionage efforts and efforts to find information they can in any way. You know, many people have said there's no proof that Russia or China had access to these documents. Number one, we don't know that. And number two, the reason the statutes are drawn the way they are is to avoid putting information that's sensitive into positions that make it easier for foreigners to get it. Because if those protections succeed, the chances they will are considerably diminished. And we know for a fact that any subordinate in the executive branch who did anything like what's alleged in the indictment with respect to Trump, if they were accused of that, they would go to prison almost certainly.
Trump is the front runner for the nomination. He's someone you served with but now oppose politically and on policy grounds in terms of how he handles a lot of different issues. Are you still considering your own run for the Republican nomination?
Well, I'm still considering it because I think it's important to remain on the edge of the water, a potential entrant into the race, both with respect to emphasizing national security issues, which I don't think we debate nearly enough for citizens to have a clear understanding what it means when they vote for a president. There's a lot at stake in the international field. We face a lot of threats and dangers. Our politicians almost never talk enough about national security. I certainly would if I got in. And second, I think it's important to defeat Trump. And I think that means a responsible potential candidate has to weigh the risk of confusing things even further than they are by having too many candidates versus whether the case against Trump can be made effectively. I think it's critical for the Republican Party to reject Trump as the nominee. I don't think he will be defeated in politics by Democrats, by a hostile media, by law enforcement. I think he needs to be defeated by Republicans.
If you run, the Republican National Committee is asking anyone who wants to be on the debate stage to pledge to support the nominee. But could you pledge to support Trump as the nominee?
Absolutely not. And I think it's at this stage, the Republican National Committee should be asking whether the debate stage ought to be open to people who have been indicted.
If Trump's the nominee, what do you do?
Well, in 2020, I wrote in the name of a conservative Republican. I live in Maryland, which is where I voted, because there was not a conservative Republican on the ballot for president, in my view. And I feel almost certain I would do the same in 24.
Would you be interested in being part of a third independent effort?
I certainly would not. I know it's being talked about. I've talked to a lot of the people who are engaged in it. I respect their motives, but I think at a time when the legitimacy of our political system itself is being called into question, to throw a third-party candidate in, which could lead to the election possibly going to the House of Representatives, would cast doubt on the legitimacy of whoever won. I think one of the things we have to focus on in rejecting Trump is to help restore faith in our basic institutions. The two-party system has a lot of negatives. A three-way race, I think, would make it almost impossible to convince large segments of the population that the race was fair.
As you explore the idea, do you have any plans later this summer to go to New Hampshire or to South Carolina or to Iowa?
Yeah, I would consider doing that. I think right now the hard question for everybody is who's already in the race is how they're going to get their message across as Trump sucks all the oxygen out of the room with this indictment. It's just a phenomenon we've never dealt with before, and now we've got another set of uncharted territories to go through. It's one reason, I think, why the public interest strongly weighs in favor of an early trial.
What is your current state, your current view of the war in Ukraine?
Well, we're in the middle of the long-awaited spring offensive. It looks like it's very rugged. The resistance is tough on the Russian side. I think we should be prepared politically for a kind of military stalemate. I think that's what Vladimir Putin is playing for, so that he can accomplish diplomatically what he's failed to accomplish militarily. I think it would be a mistake for the United States and Europe, all of NATO, to lose their will and resolve here. If it's right to defend Ukraine, to give them the material they need to counter unprovoked aggression, to preserve their independence and territorial integrity, it's right to continue to do it. And if that needs to be debated in 2024, then I think that's important to do. And if I did get in, that would be a major subject I would want to talk about.
Do you believe if Trump wins another term and serves in the White House again, he would try to remove the United States from NATO?
I feel almost certain of it, and I think that's a good example of my view that I expressed back in 2020, that Trump had done a lot of damage to the country and the party in his first term, but it was all repairable. I thought he would do more damage in a second term, and it might not be repairable.
But yet so many Republicans don't want to hear what you're saying, what other Republican critics are saying. They just seem to tune it out. Why do you think that is, and can that ever really be changed as a dynamic inside the party right now?
Well, I hope the Republican Party, I hope the Democratic Party in its own way is not succumbing to a form of Caesarism. And I think the way you defeat Caesarism is to go against the person who embodies it. I think the winner of the Republican nomination should be the most effective Trump opponent, not the person who dodges the questions the best, but the person who takes them head on. And that's one thing I'm looking for in the field of candidates.
Anybody pique your interest in case you don't end up running? Who really stands out to you at this moment?
Well, there are a number of people in the race I have a lot of respect for, and it's possible they'll catch on even in a difficult season for getting attention. I think it's a good thing at this stage to have a number of people in the race. I think letting 100 flowers bloom is a positive. I think competition and debate are good. But I think we do want to avoid the 2016 problem where there are too many candidates in. I think there are a lot of other potential candidates who are still at the edge of the water too. It's a strange election cycle.
It is. So you think maybe you wait until the fall and see how the first few debates go and then think about a late entry?
Yeah, I don't think that would be untoward at all. It could well be by that point that people have said, we don't like Trump, but we don't particularly like anybody else who's in there as well. So it's in this unusual circumstance for unusual candidates, non-professional politicians, I think there's still a good opportunity.
Former Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor, always an ambassador once you become an ambassador. We appreciate you stopping by CBS, America Decides, and having a conversation. Thank you.
Glad to be with you.